제7회 세계인문학 포럼 비조 강연에 오신
I would like to welcome all to the plenary keynote lecture of the 7th World Humanities Forum. I will be the moderator for the session, Ji-hyun An.
Welcome to the keynote speech for the 7th World Humanities Forum. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen and esteemed colleagues. My name is An Ji-hyun, faculty member in the Department of English at Seoul National University, and I will be moderating today's talk. It is indeed a great honor and pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker for this year's forum. Today's keynote speaker, Professor Jacques Aumont, does not need an introduction, as he is a world-renowned scholar whose work has pioneered the fields of film studies, visual arts, philosophy, and the humanities in general, whose work has profoundly changed and inspired academics and scholars all over the world. But Professor Aumont's work has gone further and beyond the boundaries of the academia. Indeed, it would not be an exaggeration to say that his work has changed the way we perceive the world and ourselves through the medium of images. To do justice to all of his lifetime achievements would be impossible, but let me briefly mention a few. Professor Aumont is Emeritus Professor of Aesthetics at the Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. He has taught at many universities all over the world, in France, the US, Canada, and the Netherlands. His pioneering work in proposing an approach to film aesthetics that gives full rein to the power of the image itself, with particular attention to historical determinations, has transformed the fields of aesthetics and the visual arts. He has served as the editor of many prestigious film journals, and his achievements have been awarded with the prestigious Balzan Prize in 2019. The title of today's talk is The Human Power of Images. Please join me in giving the warmest welcome to Professor Jacques Aumont.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. Very gracious indeed, almost embarrassing. Well, I have chosen an indirect way to address the major and very important issues of this forum. I've chosen to speak of images, as you see, and as I am a specialist. Images, just a second, this is it. Images reach to us. I won't dwell on that affirmation. I'll take an example right away. What do we see in this photograph? We see 5 persons, 5 people of different ages, from toddler to old women. They all look at us with different expressions. Before even knowing anything about them, we are affected by their presence, by their expressions, to which our body reacts. We experience what is called empathy. If I inquire a bit, I shall learn that these people are refugees from the north, and they were photographed by an American soldier around 1953 here in Busan. Well, I've read and heard stories about the hard lives of these refugees, and so have you, I guess. And my automatic reaction is now supplemented, if I think of it, by historical and objective knowledge. This image, along with the many others that the same photographer did, communicates something to me. I felt empathy and perhaps compassion when I discovered this image. Now I can think, for example, about the millions of refugees in the world today. This helps me go beyond my sentimental reaction and ask myself, as we are trying to do in this very forum, general, political, and humanistic questions. Sorry, excuse me. And finally, as do all images, this one does not simply record the fragment of the visible at a given moment. It opens onto some invisible that exceeds it. It is about human beings, and my projection and understanding are natural. But even then, the image reminds me that I live in a world that is made up of forces that I cannot fully penetrate. If we are careful in our use of images, they may open us up to an apprehension of our coexistence with the world, including the vast realm of the non-human. For thousands of years, images have been at the heart of the constructions of human societies and the maintenance of social ties. They have defined communities of knowledge and use which vary from one society and culture to another. This is why they only make sense in the right context. A European religious painting is destined to be displayed in a consecrated place. A Japanese painted scroll has to be presented in the tokonoma, a domestic place of sacred origin. An African mask only makes sense during ritual ceremonies, also of sacred essence. In the same way, profane images have their own sphere of circulation, making them accessible and comprehensible. The film, watched in a drive-in in the 1950s or on a smartphone today, or a manga today, or its predecessor, the ukiyo-e, 2 centuries ago, not to mention all the images on Instagram, all these circulate in a certain milieu, which in turn they coordinate. One of the most massive consequences of globalization has been to blur this correspondence between images and their context by making them circulate without limits. I can see today as much as I want of rare and precious sculptures, for instance, such as this, Quakertl mask and this archaic Greek kouros. But it will be in the space of artistic and cultural merchandise or on the internet. This is an important issue which has 2 sides, negative and positive. The problematic aspect of the circulation of images is that they are caught up in a large set where potentially everything is equal, which risks depriving them of their authentic social resonance. The mask and the statue I show were produced by human groups who saw in them something invisible, a spirit. If I see them in a museum, I shall be aware of their plastic strength and their success as art objects, but their proper cultural reference will be lost. On the other hand, on the positive side, we are learning more and more every day that an image is a major tool of communication within the human groups that populate the planet. Some of these groups have produced works that have achieved great visibility. The Greco-Roman statuary, the Christian iconography, the Buddhist statuary, the Chinese or Middle Eastern calligraphy. Other groups have remained little known for a long time, But we do know now that they, like the others, produce an iconography. The image is a human cultural asset, not specific to any particular civilization, however brilliant. That's what we are faced with today with the development of anthropological studies. I've matched this mask and this statue. A century ago, this would have been either a joke or a provocation. We know now that it is neither of these. They are both images and both endowed with the same power of communication and social bonding. Two last remarks on this point. First, to play their role as instruments of communication between individuals and groups, images have had to create social devices with rules that are often implicit but always essential. A well-known example is the cinema, which has created a very popular apparatus, including movie theaters, festivals, specialized press, film reviews in the media, etc. It's also the case for very specific types of images. For 20 or 30 years, for example, in the 19th century, the photographic visiting card was a type of image with very limited circulation among rich people and snobs, which had to invent its audience and its means of distribution. The images that are circulating by the billions today also have a device, a sophisticated, very easy to use, and without which they would not be within everyone's reach. What I want to stress is that each kind of images and of image devices creates invisible communities. The Turin shroud, to take an example, has been shown only on rare occasions for religious and then for scientific purposes. Very few people have seen it, but small groups continue to discuss it at length. To take the example of cinema again, it gave rise to groups that still function in the age of the smartphone. For example, these two apparently analogous film scenes, in fact, appeal to very different communities of connoisseurs. On the one hand, superhero fans on top, on the other hand, supporters of authorism. Second remark, some images are seen collectively, others are viewed in isolation. The Lumière cinematograph prolonged 19th century forms of collective spectacle in theater and variety, and it was this model that developed throughout the 20th century, with ever richer institutions, ever more refined technology, larger audiences, etc., etc. But there is another model, that of Edison, his kinetoscope, a solitary spectator facing the machine to see moving images, a model to which we are returning with small and mobile screens that are increasingly individual. Does this mean the end of spectator gatherings and the community they embodied? Not quite, I think. The cinema century has created habits, has fostered and consolidated group experiences, which endure beyond technical change. However, this remains a fundamental question. Is communication of the same nature in a theater where I share my reactions with an audience, or in front of a machine that sends me back to myself? Capillary distribution is a mass medium, even more so than distribution via specialized channels as in the 20th century. But it is also more isolating, for the receivers, who, in order to communicate through and with images, must bring their experience, knowledge, and vigilance into play if they are not to be misled to increasingly uncontrolled images. This is, of course, one of the challenges of images produced by artificial intelligence. They now have an existence almost analogous to images produced by traditional means, including photography and cinema. We can still distinguish them, but it will not be long before this distinction can only be made by a specialized algorithm. We are all aware of the dangers, the proliferation of fakes, the loss of credibility of images, and so on. It is too early to say what answer mankind will find to this vital and urgent question. Let's remain optimistic. Communication with and through imagery has always presupposed a more or less conscious knowledge that enables us not to confuse the artifact that mimics the visible with the visible itself. AI is progressing, but the answer lies in the parallel progress of knowledge about it, which will enable us to continue making human use of images to communicate. Let's go back to my first image. If we look at it again, in spite of everything we may know about it, we still feel with the same force the surge of empathy that reached us. I don't know exactly what overall impression to retain. Is it relaxation? Is it anguish? Is it a pose for the photographer? Is it a spontaneous attitude? But my body, on the other hand, does not need that much reasoning. It projects itself spontaneously, and differently for each of us, of course. Such is the law of empathy. It imposes itself. It does not ask for my opinion. And such is the effect of the image. It freezes empathy, choosing once and for all what in a real scene can affect us and how. The idea of empathy was invented a century and a half ago. And I'd like to emphasize two things. First, that it was from a questioning of the action of images that the idea of empathy was born, under the German name of Einfühlung. Secondly, that empathy is not sympathy nor compassion, with which it is often confused. In the words of its first proponent, Theodor Lipps, empathy is an imaginary imitation of another's experience. It reaches us involuntarily and strongly, but it does not make us share in their suffering like compassion. Imagined imitation. Images have not always been photographs. 30,000 years ago, there were images drawn in caves that reach us just as strongly as if they were from yesterday. We'll see a few in a moment. For example, this disproportion between an aurochs and horses transports us into a magical world. Even more rudimentary images, such as negative hands, reach us across the millennia, even though we don't know what they mean exactly. We don't know at all what they mean. They do not communicate with us, but they touch us immediately. It's a kind of primitive empathy. The communicative function of the image was aimed at man as a member of society. Empathy targets him as a subject endowed with a psyche, and in three ways. One, Images make their model present. They represent it. Whether it is well or poorly depicted doesn't make any difference. Even if they're imperfect in detail, we have no doubt that images convey an experience of the world. In cave parietal images, or in a child's drawing. 2. This imaginary presence is supported by a certain degree of resemblance, which in turn presupposes that I can identify this resemblance. In the child's drawing, I won't see a laptop if I've never had a laptop or never seen one. If I don't know anything about the rites of Candomblé, I won't see in these statues the Orisha spirits that they materialize for cult participants. The image is a likeness, but it can only know, I can only know what it looks like if I master certain codes. And 3, the third gift of images is expression. The smile of a refugee father, the smile of a child listening to music on his laptop, the serious expression of prehistoric animals, all are immediately perceptible. 3 inseparable subjective effects which have justified the importance we attach to images to the point sometimes of wanting to ban them. Presence, which convinces us of the reality of an experience, resemblance and meaning, which presuppose cultural knowledge, and expression, the emotional aspect of the image. Einfühlung, the empathy within the image, is the feeling that enhances the sense of presence and makes us sensitive to expression, that makes us feel the images and project ourselves into them. To see the Orisha spirit beneath the garment presupposes knowledge. To feel the state of mind of the young draftsman or the ferocity of the buffalo is given to us unconditionally. We have an innate ability to read in the image of a human being what we receive as a feeling. This is at the heart of the empathic phenomenon. Any image of a human body produces a small shock in the viewer's own body, making us feel that we are putting ourselves in the other's shoes, that we share their affects. We may be wrong. We may have misunderstood what is being expressed, but we do feel it intimately. This power has been used extensively by beliefs in a world beyond the sensible. The demons of Christian painting, the ghosts of Japanese imagery, all use direct channels to communicate pain or horror to us. In a minor mode, this has been the choice of many fantasy universes over the past half-century, for example, in the world of gaming and its derivatives. An art as realistic as portrait has largely been an art of empathy. The portrait must resemble the sitter visually, but only an empathetic impulse can persuade us that it resembles morally. When he was photographed, Churchill was preoccupied with the vital decisions he had to make during the war, and he communicates his annoyance and anxiety. On the other hand, a self-portrait like this reaches out to us almost like the Japanese demon. We can tell what the model is feeling, but we're caught up in the image, and it colors us with a feeling that is not our own. Photographic images first amazed people with their faithful reproduction of appearances, but today, on a par with handmade images, they are, above all, vectors of emotion. Some famous photos, this one, for instance, the migrant mother, or perhaps even more, the Napan girl, have become veritable icons because of their irresistible empathic power. The empathy produced by images is a remarkable power. If recognized and channeled, it can play a major role in consolidating social relations and interpersonal closeness. Of course, the speed with which images now circulate and are created necessarily engages our responsibility. We must ensure that the emotional does not prevail over the rational, nor replace understanding and, by extension, solidarity. The risk with empathy, which we must counter, is that it may lead us to believe in the reality or even in the truth of what it shows. Fake images are just as empathetic as truthful ones. The image has always played an instrumental role in shaping knowledge and cementing social ties, and it has always exercised great power in producing empathy. What has varied most in the way it has been understood and used is its indirect relationship with the essence of the world that surrounds us. How does the human relate to the non-human? Historically, humanity has followed two concurrent and sometimes antagonistic paths: that of science, objective knowledge, and that of belief, ritualized or not. These two paths were present from the start in images. The images drawn in caves were visually accurate, but their purpose was magical or fetishistic. The scientific on the one hand, the supernatural or spiritual on the other, two opposing or complementary ways of approaching the enigma of the non-human world. We are not finished with this dichotomy. Let me take the simplest example, that of the relationship between humans and animals. The human body in its natural functions is an animal body. And animals are close to humans in many other ways. Some animals have a memory, some are able to reason to a certain degree, etc. The major point of difference remains that the animal has no artificial means of communication and expression, no language, properly speaking, no images. Humans have always recognized this closeness to animals. It is essential to shamanic and fetish beliefs, where the animal becomes the incarnation of a spirit, like in this American statue or in these African objects. It is interesting to see that this belief has persisted in civilizations that were intended to be more rational. For instance, in Egyptian hieroglyphs, or very differently, in the catalogues of human temperaments in the 16th and 17th European centuries. Animals were used to help humans reflect on their own condition, as here. Even today, it's hard to escape the reflex of projecting human feelings or human characters onto animals. It is interesting to note that while humans were able to depict animals accurately from the very beginning, it's as though they subsequently gave up this ability in favor of a more immediate, less rational, but spontaneous relationship, and had to constantly relearn objective knowledge about the animal. Mediterranean civilizations had returned to simplified states of representing them, like this and this other ox. Western iconography is a long journey of rediscovery of what prehistoric man knew. When the painter Albrecht Dürer draws a cat around 1500, he does so with perfect accuracy. But his rhinoceros has a fantastic touch, as does Lange's 2 centuries later. It was ultimately photography that provided the irrefutable means of producing real documentary images of a rhinoceros. The invention of digital technology has added many technical qualities to this documentary approach, making it possible to multiply images and catalogs of images. All this is very interesting for our mastery of the animal world, but it's still our mastery that is at stake. In other words, the subjugation of animals by humans. The animal is man's prey, or it works for man, or it entertains or comforts man, like our so many pets. The documentary image, useful for knowledge, reproduces the dissymmetry of relations. It is the human who makes the images and who considers the non-human for his own ends. What about the other path, the magical or spiritual way? Humans never cease to marvel at the very fact of existence, but being remains impenetrable to us, and human life takes place for the most part in a double of reality where the image is at its most effective, since it precisely creates an imaginary double of the world. Therefore, the image has no difficulty in evoking entities inaccessible to our senses. The Japanese ghost was imaginary, but not more imaginary than the spirits portrayed at the end of the 19th century in spiritist photos, which were fakes, of course. Or better, perhaps, in the post-mortem photos, which portray and stage the deceased as if they were still there, allowing us to experience something unspeakable about this last enigma of our lives. Today, we can have erratic photos, which of course are pure fantasy. Animals have lost much of their magical prestige since photography, which prevents us from imagining them as other than they are. However, I am struck by the current proliferation of vivid animal images, which cultivate sensation, even the sensational, and have in common an attempt to move away from the documentary to reach another reality, less scientific than poetic. This tapeworm, for instance, these manatees are living beings. They actually exist, but their staging in the photos presents them as highly humanized monsters. The result is ambiguous. Do I feel closer to the animal portrayed in this way, or have humans once again invented a tool that allows them to take control of the situation? Similar things could be said about the plant environment, although this is a much more recent idea, the so-called plant turn. For a very long time, it was considered a paradox that plants are living entities, but immobile and inexpressive, and therefore more or less inert in our eyes. It was through notions that were a little vague, but very prevalent in certain cultural contexts, that trees, flowers, grasses came to be seen as entities worthy of consideration, even sometimes going so far as to appear not as objects, but as subjects. Certain trees, for instance, and even more certain images of trees pertaining to what's called pareidolia, convinces visibly that the tree is an autonomous being, and why not, a feeling being. But this is because it then resembles a human, as was demonstrated in a funny way by the ends of the Lord of the Rings. In fact, we are still caught regarding plants in anthropocentric notions, such as landscape, an idea that is common to several cultures and has been further popularized by photography. Painting in China, in Europe, later in North America, has exalted this feeling of nature that would be there in front of us, giving off no meaning, but something like a spirit of its own, which we could perceive or sense. Of course, this is again a human look at the outside world, but it implies some real openness to the non-human environment, and it may lead to a reconsideration and a detection of its own properties. One does not truly see a landscape is not sensitive to some ineffable quality that this view of nature does deliver. In the same way, I'll be brief here, images of the cosmos, even those made for purely scientific purposes like these two, open up a world in which we don't recognize ourselves, but in which we are literally immersed. They serve to increase our knowledge, of course, but such images take us into the infinite world. And if we have a little imagination and sensitivity, they may yield something like a blissful giddiness. All in all, what I see as striking about images' relationship with the world, living and non-living, is in this first quarter of the 21st century, is an intricate combination of documentary, more or less assumed spiritualism, and expressivity. These appealing images often aim for sensationalism rather than information or emotion, but they betray the human fascination for all its coexistence. Besides, the often gleaming sides of the images on offer ties in with the long history of the fantastic and the ghostly in the image, and today extends into another, even more fantastic hypothesis that the images themselves are alive. There are books on that. This overly animistic proposition is probably not to be taken literally, but as a stimulus to reflection, it is highly suggestive. For instance, how are we to understand the appeal of the images produced in generative adversarial networks, where a machine learns to produce images, these GANs which exert so much fascination on contemporary artists? You see here an artist's work. it's easy to get the impression of an intelligence and perhaps of some strange form of vitality at work in these images sequences when they attempt to approximate a model. Images have always had many uses. Memory images, private or collective, images linked to play, religious images, images of art. In all these uses of images, there is a stepping back from the reality in which we are immersed, and which imposes itself on us without giving us any meaning. Gaming abstracts us from reality to create another provisional reality, although it may last forever nowadays. Memory turns our lived reality into something like a narrative. Art may become a tool for contemplation and withdrawal from reality. I have tried instead to highlight other virtues of images which can bring the same powers into play, but for other purposes. Used as a means of communication, the image has a status that is either interpersonal or public, and often a mixture of both. The exploratory images I mentioned last aim at something like revelation, when they don't have outright ambition to open us up to a reality that is itself difficult to perceive. Finally, the register of emotion, undoubtedly the most archaic of all, plays on the raw powers of the human body and produces the phenomenon of empathy. These great functions, values, and powers of images do not contradict their individual and personal uses. As in all our lives, there's a dialectic between what comes from us, our consciousness, our memory, our mind, and what comes from the world. This reality which we will probably never master, but which we must address from all sides, if possible through coordinated efforts. Through its enormous social reach, the image, perhaps more than language, is a privileged means of coordinating human efforts. I shall conclude with two remarks, which I'll try to make as optimistic as possible. First remark, living together as a society is based on consensus, but also on dissensus, discussion, dispute, contradiction, war. The globalization of images, since their automated reproduction 2 centuries ago, has enhanced their role in this process, which is inevitable and in fact indispensable. There's no such thing as a self-revealing truth, and discussion will always be the most important social activity, the one that alone enables us to act with a genuine knowledge of facts. We're reminded of this every day now, especially at this time, and especially since the mass circulation of images began. Countless caricatures are designed to do just that, stir up controversy. The same is true of moving image works. Many films are designed to spark debate while dramatizing ideological aspects of our societies. What was known once as militant cinema was designed to spur action. In a 1968 film, it is asserted that, you can read it, every spectator is a coward or a traitor. You must act, you must participate, not to be a coward or a traitor. In a totally different way, the message of films from the past may become unacceptable or partly unacceptable today. There's one very famous example now, that of The Birth of the Nation, with its praise of the Ku Klux Klan. The image communicates, it moves, it reveals, but always by mingling with conversation, with discussion, and sometimes dispute. Second remark, the digital revolution has brought an absolute novelty. We no longer just look at images, we make them instantly and without difficulty. Images are increasingly seen by viewers who are not surprised by them because they make some themselves, usually in large quantities. This has not overturned our relationship with images, but it has added a kind of conscious distance to them, which means that at the same time as we see an image, we also see virtually the way it was made, especially, as I said before, since the advent of AI-generated images. This increasingly concrete knowledge of how images are made tends to make them the medium of more intellectual discussions, with exchanges of arguments, explicit questioning, and so on. Images have never fulfilled their communicative function as much as they do today. However, neither empathy nor an escape into non-human worlds have disappeared from images as they appear to us. My conviction is that the empathic power of an image has not diminished with the digital age, but that its relationship to other equally important dimensions, such as truth, has profoundly changed. This kind of violent images were much seen in France in 2023. They are very striking, and they make you react immediately. But after all, they're only fakes. We urgently need to reflect on the new paths taken by images, because they shape our lives and commit us totally to them. Images have become intelligent, yet they continue to work on our bodies. It's up to us to manage this contradiction intelligently. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Omong. Perhaps you can have a glass of water while we're waiting. Okay. Thank you for your gracious talk, for this lucid and insightful analysis into the relationship between images and empathy, and the power of images to transform and shape the way humans communicate with humans and non-humans in the 21st century. Now, with the time remaining, we're actually out of time, but I think I have about 5 minutes. Maybe 2 or 3 questions from the floor. I'm sure the audience has many questions. 저 질의응답 시간으로 들어가는데요. 저희가 시간이 많이 없어서 한 5분 정도 할애할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 한 2-3분께서 질문해 주시면.
So due to the time limit, we can take maybe about 2 or 3 questions, and feel free to ask questions either in Korean or in English. So I will translate the question.
Any questions from the floor? 일어나서 해주세요. 감사합니다.
Can you please stand up? Thank you.
First, thank you for your inspirational speech. I have one question. You told us that the images, they only take on their full meaning when they are related to their original context. And I'd be really appreciate if you could explain more about this, because like if paintings are in museum or gallery, like do you think they don't have full meaning? Like even if they are out of original context, but maybe would they have a full meaning in current context? Or they can't carry on the original context in museums or gallery? Can you explain more?
Oh, of course, I could explain for hours, but I thought it was a more or less trivial idea. We do not see images from the past, even the fairly recent past, as the contemporaries saw them. Take any example, take the example of the Velázquez Venus that has been not exactly lacerated, but there have been something thrown at it at the National Gallery yesterday or the day before yesterday. It's a masterpiece by Velázquez, one of the greatest painters. And what we see when we go to London, to the National Gallery, is this beautiful painting. We see beauty, we see a nude woman, so if we're perhaps an activist feminist, we protest against the nudity of women in painting. We can relate it to nude paintings in the 16th and 17th century, but we have no notion of what a friend or a contemporary from Velázquez saw in this painting. All we know is that his eyes were struck by the same kind of visual rays that ours, but the ideas that were in his or her mind at the time, we must reconstruct them. That's the work of historians of art. It needs hundreds of pages to reconstruct a context for viewing a painting, not a very old one in this instance. If you address parietal paintings, of which I've shown a few, the task is almost impossible. Nobody knows what the men or women who painted them thought, or desired, or intended, or wanted. We just have the images and they are baffling, they're stupefying. But what do they mean? Nothing, nothing for us, absolutely nothing, because we've lost absolutely the whole context. So I'm sorry, these are extremely banal examples, but I may not have understood your question.
질문이 되셨나요? 네. 예, 앞에 계신 선생님.
Yes, we'll have the microphone over to the person in the front.
Thank you for your lectures. Immensely inspired by your lecture. But my question is this. AI has made constantly many fake knowledge, fake image, fake opinion to the people. This fake can certainly lead sometimes the world to chaos or destruction or tragic situation in the 21st century. So that I propose you to stop the further development of AI. Do you agree or not? Thank you.
I think that we're all in favor of stopping fakes, of course. We all agree.
예, 질문이 혹시 없으시면 제가 한 가지 질문을, if I may ask you a few questions while waiting for the audience. I was fascinated by your, construction of the relationship between images and language. At some point, you say that images are the medium through, through which we can form knowledge, but on the other hand, you also privilege language and communication sphere over images and empathy. So I would like to ask you to clarify a little bit more in that respect. And my second question is actually a much more difficult question. It's a very fundamental question. You showed that simple, poignant picture of North Korean family in the very beginning. And I think you have a hopeful, longing that we all would feel some kind of empathy because we all do react. But, Suzanne Sontag and others, have mentioned that most modern spectators, we actually are very indifferent and we are spectators and consumers of violence and suffering. And you showed the interesting, clip of The Birth of a Nation, for instance. So my question is, wouldn't some pictures evoke hate and indifference, although for other people, it creates certain solidarity towards empathy? Thank you.
Well, as you can imagine, answering such a question would take forever. But I'll leave aside the question language versus images because that would be too much. I'll concentrate, if you allow me to, on the question of empathy. Empathy is, my definition of empathy is not perhaps the most current definition of it. When I read about empathy, I see that it's absolutely confused with compassion. I tried to take it back to its first meaning in the 19th century, which assigns empathy to a bodily reaction, which we can't master. We have it, we experience it, whether we want or not. That's our body that reacts. My body is not your body, obviously, and they won't react in the same way in front of the same image. I may be in a sort of stupor when you may remain totally indifferent. That's a quite, no, it's a basic but absolutely fundamental questions. My body is not yours, your body is not mine. That's all there is to it, in my opinion. But the phenomenon of empathy is there. Well, I know the books of Susan Sontag, of course. I don't agree with her. Of course, the indifference seems to have developed. We can digest such a number of unwanted images that we become fatigued, tired of seeing them, and indifference is sometimes the result. But when we are watching images, when we're just, not just seeing them, but watching them in an exposition, in an exhibition, for instance. The image of the Pusan refugees I saw in an exhibition, I was there standing in front of this huge photograph. There was a reaction, there was. I didn't know these people, I don't know their personal history. It struck me. It may not have struck another person, but empathy it's not an objective phenomenon. It's objective in as much as it exists, not in as much as it has a definite result once and for all. That's about what I can say in 5 minutes.
Thank you. Perhaps one more question before we finish. 한 분 정도 자, 여기 중간에 계신 선생님 한 분만 더 질문 받겠습니다.
우매한 질문인지 모르겠는데요.
I don't know if this might be an ignorant question. 알아듣기 힘들다.
아니면 그대로 되고
Images. Some images are natural. Some come from the nature. Some images are man-made, artificial image. But we give meaning to the images and we study about them, like by experts. So you are supposed to feel this about this image. So
Professor Oman, was that
what is the reason for that?
question? I think he's asking, some pictures are from nature and some are
Yes.
artificially created. What's the reason?
I have perfectly understood the distinction between natural images and artificial images, man-made images. What I'm wondering is what would be natural images? The face we read in the moon?
I think he's referring to like pictures of nature, trees, mountains, flowers.
But all images are man-made. The only example that comes to my mind is the famous man in the moon. For centuries there was the idea that the moon depicted a human face. Of course it was a pure projection, but is that an image? It's an image imagined by man. I don't see what a non-man-made image would be. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm wanting imagination.
I think you got the question and it's been translated. 예, 질문 감사드립니다, 선생님. 예, 시간 관계상 그럼
Due to the time limit, so we have to wrap up this lecture. So another round of applause for Professor Omong, please.
네, 여러분 진행에 수고해주신 서울대학교 안지원 교수님께도 큰 박수 보내주시기 바랍니다. 감사합니다. 네, 이렇게 제7회 세계 인문학 포럼 개막식과 함께 기조 강연까지 함께 하셨습니다. 이어지는 분과 회의 세션에도 여러분들 많은 참여해 주시면 감사드리겠습니다. 자세한 내용은 나눠드린 리플릿을 참고해 주시면 되겠고요. 저희 착용하셨던 리시버는 나가시는 길에 꼭 반납해 주시기를 부탁드립니다. 제7회 세계 인문학 포럼 오늘부터 3일간 금요일까지 열리는데요. 많은 성원과 관심 부탁드립니다. 함께해 주신 여러분 고맙습니다.